Sergeant Ramos, now white as a ghost, felt the weight of the crowd's stares upon him, public shame consuming him. His authority crumbled there in the middle of the street before the woman he dared to call a socialite. The dust of humiliation still hung over Sergeant Ramos, denser than the truck's exhaust smoke. His eyes, once full of arrogance, were now pools of despair, fixed on the ground as if searching for a hole to hide in. The crowd, previously curious, was now a silent chorus of judgment, each gaze an arrow piercing his dignity. The socialite, as he had called her, watched him with cold serenity, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within him. It was at that exact moment of paralysis that the siren of a luxury patrol car tore through the air, announcing the arrival of a more imposing presence. A black SUV with tinted windows stopped abruptly a few meters away. The rear door clicked open, and from it emerged Colonel Almeida. Tall, imposing, with an impeccable uniform that looked freshly laundered, Almeida exuded unquestionable authority, tempered by a hint of impatience. His eyes swept the scene, landing first on Sergeant Ramos, then on the crowd, and finally on the truck driver, who remained calmly leaning against his vehicle's door, observing everything with the air of someone who had seen it all 1,000 times before. "What the devil is going on here, Sergeant Ramos?" The colonel's voice was a muffled thunder, yet laden with contained fury. "Why this gathering, and why is this cargo still stopped?" Ramos tried to speak, but the words tangled in his dry throat. He stammered, pointing at the truck driver with a trembling finger. "Sir, Colonel, it's just this driver." Colonel Almeida dismissed Ramos with an impatient wave. He had no time for his subordinate's incompetence. His gaze fixed on the truck driver, sizing him up. A middle-aged man, robust, with a worn cap and an unshaven beard. Nothing to indicate any serious trouble, just another truck driver trying to skirt the rules. "All right, my friend," the colonel said, approaching with a condescending smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It seems the sergeant here is having trouble making himself understood. Let's see if I can be clearer. This cargo, it needs to be released. And for that, we need to sort out some details, don't we?" The truck driver, who had remained silent until then, straightened up. His eyes, previously calm, now held a steely glint. "Details, Colonel?" His voice was deep, without any trace of fear or submission. "What kind of details are you referring to?" Colonel Almeida's smile widened, revealing a set of white teeth and an air of superiority. "Oh, the usual details, my dear. The bureaucracy, you know, a small contribution to expedite the process. After all, time is money, isn't it? And your truck is blocking the road." He gestured to the line of vehicles beginning to form. "Let's say a symbolic amount, something to show your goodwill in cooperating with order." The tension in the air was almost palpable. The crowd, watching in silence, seemed to hold its breath. Sergeant Ramos, still pale, watched the scene with a mixture of dread and fascination. He knew the colonel's modus operandi. The truck driver took a step forward, his posture now erect, almost military. His eyes didn't waver from the colonel's. "I see. You are demanding a bribe to release cargo that is in order, with complete documentation and without any irregularities." The question, delivered with cutting calm, caught the colonel by surprise. His smile faltered for an instant, but he quickly recomposed himself. "Don't use that word, my friend. We're talking about a service fee, a facilitation. That's how things work around here." He extended his hand, palm open, in an unmistakable gesture. "Come on, let's not waste any more time. The faster you cooperate, the faster you'll be on your way." The truck driver, instead of reaching for his wallet, brought his hand to the inner pocket of his worn jacket. Colonel Almeida raised an eyebrow, expecting the money. The crowd murmured, some indignant, others resigned. Slowly, the truck driver pulled out a dark leather wallet. It wasn't a common wallet. It was more robust, with a discreet embossed crest. He opened it, and from inside, instead of bills, he took out a card. It wasn't a credit card, nor a driver's license. It was an official identification document. Colonel Almeida, impatient, extended his hand to take what he expected to be some form of identification, to note down the details. But the truck driver didn't hand the card to him. Instead, he held it firmly between his thumb and forefinger, slowly turning it so the colonel could read. Colonel Almeida's eyes, previously full of greed and arrogance, widened. Color drained from his face, replaced by a grayish pallor. His jaw dropped. The smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure terror. What he saw was not a driver's ID, nor even that of an influential businessman. The card, with its austere design and the Republic's emblem displayed in bold letters, Army General, and right below the name, General Marco Antonio de Oliveira, and a crucial detail, on secret inspection. Colonel Almeida's world collapsed in an instant. The air thinned. The sound of the crowd became a distant hum. He felt cold sweat trickle down his neck. The truck driver, the man he had just tried to extort, was not a simple driver. He was a general on inspection, secret. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira, still holding his official ID, looked directly into the colonel's wide eyes. His voice, previously just deep, now resonated with the authority of one who commands thousands. "Colonel Almeida, it seems you have some details to explain to me, starting with your service fee and the way your subordinates treat citizens, and of course, your interpretation of military laws." Colonel Almeida stumbled back a step, tripping over his own feet. Sergeant Ramos, watching from afar, saw the card and the colonel's face. He knew. He knew hell had arrived. Ramos's shame was insignificant compared to the dread now consuming his superior. The general didn't need to say anything more. The mere display of that official ID and the mention of secret inspection was a sentence. The road, once a stage for corruption, had become a general's tribunal, and the verdict for Colonel Almeida seemed already to have been delivered. Colonel Almeida felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. The air, once thick with his own arrogance, was now a cold vacuum that stole his breath. His mind, accustomed to calculating bribes and advantages, froze. A general, on secret inspection. The words echoed in his head like a hammer, shattering every pillar of his self-confidence and power. The cold sweat, trickling down his neck, now felt like melting ice, running down his spine. His eyes, previously fixed on the ID, darted to the general's face, searching for a sign of clemency, a mistake, anything that could undo that nightmare. But there was nothing but relentless seriousness, the unquestionable authority of one who held the power to dismantle not just his career, but his entire life. Color drained from Almeida's face, replaced by a grayish hue of terror. His jaw, once firm in its condescension, now hung loose. He tried to stammer something, but his voice failed, caught in his dry throat. The words, "Sir, General, I can explain," barely scratched the air, more a whisper of desperation than a plea. He stumbled back a step, then another, tripping over his own feet, his body betraying his collapsing mind. The impeccable uniform, once a symbol of his authority, now seemed like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. Sergeant Ramos, watching from afar, saw the card and the colonel's face. He knew. He knew hell had arrived and that he was right in the middle of it. Ramos's shame was insignificant compared to the dread now consuming his superior, but the fear of being dragged along was palpable. He felt a knot in his stomach, a premonition of doom that made him tremble uncontrollably. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira, with a slow and deliberate movement, put his official ID back into the inner pocket of his worn jacket. There was no hurry, just the certainty of one in absolute control. His eyes swept the scene, from the paralyzed colonel to Sergeant Ramos, who now seemed to want to merge with the asphalt. The crowd, previously a silent chorus of judgment, now murmured in a mix of astonishment and satisfaction. Some applauded discreetly, others merely watched with silent admiration. The socialite, standing beside her car, observed with an expression of silent vindication, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. Justice, after all, was not blind. The general then made a subtle gesture with his head towards the black SUV that had brought the colonel. Immediately the driver's door of the SUV opened, and a man in civilian clothes, but with the unmistakable posture of a high-ranking military officer, stepped out. He needed no verbal orders. His eyes met the general's, and a tacit understanding was exchanged. Captain Silva, as the general would later call him, was the personification of efficiency and discretion. General Marco Antonio raised a hand, a gesture that instantly silenced the colonel, cutting off any attempt at defense or plea. "There is nothing to explain, Colonel Almeida. What I saw and heard is more than sufficient. Your conduct and that of your subordinate is an affront to the honor of the army and the trust of the people we swore to protect." His voice, previously deep, now resonated with the authority of one who commands thousands, each word a precise and unquestionable blow. Your service fee and the way your men treat citizens, especially those who work honestly to move the country's economy, are unacceptable. And your interpretation of military laws, Colonel, is, at the very least, criminal. He turned to Captain Silva. "Captain, please arrange for the immediate detention of Colonel Almeida and Sergeant Ramos. They will be taken to the base for formal interrogation. All evidence will be collected, including testimonies from the citizens present and security camera footage, if any. Ensure that no documents are misplaced and that the integrity of the scene is maintained." Captain Silva, with a firm nod, was already moving. Two other men, who until then had seemed merely passengers in the SUV, descended and approached the corrupt officers with cold, calculated efficiency. Colonel Almeida, still in shock, was gently but firmly escorted to the SUV. His resistance was minimal, his dignity non-existent. His eyes, once full of greed, now reflected only the emptiness of despair. Sergeant Ramos, upon seeing the scene, finally collapsed. His knees gave way, and he was supported by the general's men, who lifted him and led him towards the vehicle, a puppet without strings. His arrogance of minutes ago completely pulverized. General Marco Antonio then turned his attention to the crowd. "I apologize for the inconvenience caused. Justice will be served. This truck and all others that were improperly detained will be released immediately." He looked at the woman Ramos had insulted. "Madam, your patience and integrity were remarkable. I thank you for standing firm and not yielding to intimidation." The woman merely nodded, a discreet smile appearing on her lips, a small personal victory amidst the great rectification. The general then approached the cab of his own truck. "Excuse me, Captain Silva," he said, as the captain prepared to take command of the situation on the road. "I will personally ensure this cargo is delivered to its destination. It is a matter of principle, and also to ensure there are no more details along the way. That truck, which had once been a symbol of extortion and abuse, now became a vehicle of righteousness and justice, guided by a general who did not forget his origins or his duties. The road, which moments before had been a stage for corruption and abuse of power, now witnessed a cleansing. The dust of humiliation mingled with the dust of redemption. For Colonel Almeida and Sergeant Ramos, the future was bleak, an abyss of disgrace and dishonor, with the shadow of a military tribunal hanging over their heads. For General Marco Antonio, it was just the beginning of an inspection that promised to sweep the dirt out of the barracks, a mission he undertook with the seriousness of one who knew the weight of his uniform. The tension did not dissipate. It merely changed form from a direct confrontation to the anticipation of consequences that would unfold in the corridors of military power. The lesson was clear. The uniform, no matter how high the rank, was not a shield against justice, especially when justice came disguised as a truck driver. The silence that followed General Marco Antonio de Oliveira's order was more deafening than any scream. It was not a silence of peace, but of shock, shame, and an implacable justice descending upon the dusty road. The general's men, with almost robotic efficiency, moved. Colonel Almeida, a spectre of his former self, was guided to the black SUV. His eyes, once sparkling with arrogance, were now empty wells of despair, fixed on a distant point, as if desperately trying to escape the reality that swallowed him. He offered no resistance, not a word of protest. His mind seemed to have shut down, unable to process the speed and irreversibility of his fall. Sergeant Ramos, in turn, was a spectacle of disintegration. His knees gave way completely, and he collapsed onto the hot asphalt, his hands covering his face in a futile attempt to hide the humiliation. The general's men lifted him with the same firmness they used with Almeida, but with a barely disguised note of contempt. Ramos was a broken man, his bluster and brutality reduced to dust. As he was dragged to the vehicle, his eyes briefly met those of the socialite, the woman he had insulted. In her gaze there was no triumph, only a cold resignation, confirmation that the wheel of fortune had turned. The SUV departed without fanfare, taking with it the two corrupt officers and the promise of an inquiry that would shake the foundations of military command. The dust raised by the car's departure seemed to symbolize the dirt the general was determined to sweep away. The crowd, previously paralyzed, began to stir, a murmur of voices rising, mixing astonishment, relief, and a hint of satisfaction. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira, still in his truck driver's jacket and cap disguising his rank, turned to the other detained truck drivers and citizens. His voice, though softer now, still carried the weight of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize again for the inconvenience. This incident is a stain on our institution, but I assure you it will be dealt with the severity it deserves. All detained vehicles will be released immediately. There will be no more undue fees or details." The socialite, who had remained beside her car, approached the general. "General," she began, her voice choked with emotion. I don't know what to say. Thank you so much. I had already lost hope." The general smiled lightly, a rare and genuine smile. "You're welcome, madam. It is my duty, and yours not to yield was fundamental. Corruption thrives in silence and complacency. Your voice, even if a whisper, made a difference." He gave a brief bow. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a cargo to deliver." He turned and walked towards his own truck, the metal giant he had driven for hundreds of miles. The cab, once a stage for extortion, was now a symbol of righteousness. He opened the door, climbed the steps, and sat behind the wheel, the same wheel Almeida had tried to use for his illicit gain. His fingers brushed the leather, feeling the vibration of the engine he had just started. The image of an army general in a truck driver's uniform, taking the wheel of a cargo vehicle to ensure delivery, was powerful. It was a silent declaration that honor and duty were not privileges of office, but principles that should guide every action in any post. As the heavy truck began to move, General Marco Antonio de Oliveira felt the weight of responsibility. This was not just an isolated incident, it was a symptom. The secret inspection was much more than a simple routine check. There were rumors, whispers of a corruption network that extended through several layers of the hierarchy, involving not only checkpoints, but also contracts, bids, and embezzlement of resources. Colonel Almeida was just a small fish, a visible link in a much larger chain. The road ahead stretched under the afternoon sun, an invitation to more miles and more revelations. The general knew that the arrest of Almeida and Ramos would be just the tip of the iceberg. The news would spread like wildfire, causing panic and chain reactions. Others, more powerful and cunning, would try to cover their tracks, perhaps even retaliate. The tension did not diminish, it merely transformed from a direct confrontation to a silent war against an invisible enemy, entrenched within their own ranks. He gripped the steering wheel, determination etched on his face. His mission was to clean house, to restore the trust and honor of the army. And he would do it, 1 kilometer at a time, one corrupt official at a time, no matter how high the rank or how deep the dirt. The journey was just beginning, and General Marco Antonio de Oliveira was ready for every turn, every obstacle, every battle that presented itself on the path. The road, once a stage for corruption, was now the path of redemption, and he, the truck driver general, was its guardian. The deep rumble of the truck's engine filled the cab, a familiar and comforting sound for General Marco Antonio de Oliveira. But this time, it wasn't just the sound of the road. It was the pulse of a mission that had just escalated to a new level of danger and complexity. The afternoon sun painted the horizon in orange hues, but the light stretching over the road couldn't dispel the shadow that hung over his thoughts. Almeida and Ramos were just the beginning. The tip of an iceberg of corruption that he knew, by instinct and preliminary information, was much larger and deeper. He gripped the steering wheel, feeling the vibration of the machine beneath his hands. The truck driver's jacket, the cap, the unshaven beard, all part of the disguise that had led him to witness firsthand the rot corroding the very core of his institution. The image of Colonel Almeida, once so arrogant, now a broken and humiliated man, flashed in his mind. There was no satisfaction in it, only a deep sadness for the dishonor of a uniform he so cherished. The news of a colonel and a sergeant arrested for extortion in broad daylight by a truck driver who turned out to be a general would spread like wildfire. And that meant the silent war he anticipated was about to become much louder. The true architects of the corruption network, those who benefited from embezzlement, overpriced contracts and influence peddling, would now be on high alert. They would try everything to cover their tracks, to silence witnesses, to discredit the investigation. The radio in the cab, which had been playing country music, was now silent, a reminder of the seriousness of the moment. He picked up the military communicator radio hidden under the seat. "Captain Silva, are you there?" The captain's voice came almost immediately with a slight hiss. "General." "Yes, sir. Everything under control here. The vehicles have been released. Almeida and Ramos are en route to the base under maximum escort. Evidence is being collected as per your orders." "Excellent, Captain. Any immediate reaction from command?" The general knew that military bureaucracy was a labyrinth, and news of a scandal like this would certainly send shockwaves. There was a brief pause. "Yes, sir, we've already received calls, many calls, from high offices. There's a clear attempt to suppress the incident, to classify it as a misunderstanding or overzealousness. But I made it clear that the order came directly from you, and that the investigation will proceed without interference." Silva's voice was firm, loyal. "Good work, Captain. Keep me informed of any developments, however minor, and above all protect the evidence and witnesses, especially the lady who was insulted. She is crucial." The general knew the pressure on Silva would be immense. "Understood, General. And you? The cargo?" "The cargo is safe. I'm en route to the final destination as planned. It's vital that this delivery is made personally. There's more at stake than just the contents of these boxes, Captain. There's a principle." He turned off the radio, his mind buzzing. The cargo. It was a shipment of sensitive communication equipment destined for a border unit. A perfect target for diversion and sale on the black market, or worse, to enemy groups. That's why he had insisted on driving it personally, disguised. He needed to see with his own eyes how the network operated, who was involved in the chain of command that allowed such diversions. Almeida was just a toll, but who was at the top of the pyramid that allowed that toll to exist? The road began to narrow, trees closing in on both sides, transforming the landscape into a green tunnel. The sunlight diminished, and with it, the sense of security. The tension was no longer that of direct confrontation, but of an invisible threat that could emerge from any bend, any shadow. He was a general, yes, but there, in that truck, he was a solitary target, a man who had just declared war on a powerful faction within his own army. He felt a shiver, not of fear, but of cold anticipation. He knew retaliation would come. It could be subtle, an attempt to discredit him, to fabricate accusations, or it could be more direct, more dangerous. Corruption, when deeply rooted, defended itself fiercely. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira gripped the steering wheel tighter. His military instincts, sharpened by decades of service, screamed alert. This was no coincidence. The high offices were already acting. The attempt to suppress the case had failed, and now the threat was becoming physical. He accelerated slightly, testing the pursuer's reaction. The light in the rearview mirror seemed to intensify for a brief moment, before receding again, maintaining distance. It was a cat-and-mouse game, and the general knew he was at a disadvantage. A heavy truck was not the ideal vehicle for a chase or an escape. He activated a discreet tracking system on his dashboard, a secret device known only to him and a few others in high command. The digital map on the small screen lit up, showing the route and, to his surprise, a red dot blinking about 2 kilometers behind. It wasn't one, but 2 vehicles. They were fast, and they were maintaining a constant distance like lurking wolves. The tension in the cab was almost palpable. The road, once a path of redemption, now seemed like a trap. He wasn't just delivering cargo, he was becoming the cargo itself, a valuable target for those who wanted to silence him. The journey was just beginning, and General Marco Antonio de Oliveira was ready for every battle, every ambush, every lie thrown his way. The honor of the army depended on it, and he, the truck driver general, would not fail. Darkness swallowed the landscape, and with it, the certainty that the night would bring more than just the promise of a new day. It would bring the battle he knew was inevitable. Darkness swallowed the landscape, and with it, the certainty that the night would bring more than just the promise of a new day. It would bring the battle he knew was inevitable. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira felt the weight of the steering wheel in his hands. The engine's rumble, a somber counterpoint to the tense silence within the cab. The 2 red dots on the tracker, 2 kilometers away, were a chilling confirmation that the hunt had begun. It was no longer a question of if, but of when and how they would attack. He was a general, a strategist, a man accustomed to commanding armies and anticipating enemy movements. But there, in that truck, he was a solitary target with vital cargo and an even more important mission: to unmask the rot that corroded the heart of his institution. The honor of the army, the principle he had mentioned to Captain Silva, was the fuel that drove him. The road snaked through dense woods, trees forming an impenetrable barrier on both sides. There were no houses, no gas stations, just darkness and asphalt, a perfect scenario for an ambush. He slowed slightly, not to yield ground, but to observe. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, swept the rearview mirrors and the stretch ahead. Every shadow, every bush could hide a threat. The vehicles behind him maintained their distance, a tactic of intimidation perhaps, or they were waiting for the right moment, the most favorable terrain. The general knew that a heavy truck was vulnerable on tight turns and steep climbs. He needed space, visibility, but the road seemed to conspire against him, becoming increasingly winding and narrow. Suddenly, One of the red dots on the tracker accelerated, closing the distance to just over a kilometer. Then, the other vehicle did the same. They were approaching, coordinated. They were not amateurs. The general activated a small audio recorder hidden in the dashboard and a system of high-resolution external cameras. Every movement, every sound would be recorded. The evidence was his greatest weapon. He pressed the military communicator radio button again, but hesitated. Calling Silva now would expose his location and the nature of the threat. Silva already had his hands full, dealing with the fallout from the incident with Almeida. He needed to manage alone, at least for now. Discretion was crucial. The first vehicle, a dark and powerful sedan, appeared in the rearview mirror. Its headlights, previously discreet, now shone with intensity, momentarily blinding the general. The second vehicle, a pickup truck, was right behind. They were in attack formation. The general felt adrenaline pumping, but his mind remained cold, analytical. The sedan attempted an aggressive overtake on a short straight. The general, anticipating the move, kept the truck firm in the center of the lane, giving no room. The sedan driver honked, a shrill sound that echoed in the night. The general ignored it. He wouldn't make it easy. The pickup truck, in turn, began to approach from behind, almost bumper to bumper with the truck. It was a pincer tactic, designed to force the truck driver to stop or lose control. The general increased speed, forcing the pickup truck to back off slightly to avoid a collision. The truck, with its mass, was a mobile fortress. In the rearview mirror, he saw a flash of light coming from the pickup truck. It wasn't a headlight, it was the gleam of a laser. A red laser pointer danced for an instant in the cab, before fixing on his face, a clear message. They wanted him to stop. They knew who he was, or at least who they thought he was. A stubborn truck driver who had gotten involved where he shouldn't have. The general smiled, a cold and determined smile. They didn't know who they were dealing with. He wasn't just a truck driver, he was a general, and a general doesn't yield to intimidation. He turned on the windshield wipers as if the laser were just dirt. The sedan, frustrated by the lack of space, backed off slightly and tried a new tactic. It began flashing its headlights intermittently, a universal sign to stop. The general responded with a long, deep honk, a sound that seemed to tear through the darkness. The road began to climb a mountain pass, the curves becoming sharper. The general knew this was their chance. A heavy truck would lose speed on ascents, becoming more vulnerable. He shifted into a lower gear, the engine roaring in protest but maintaining torque. Suddenly, the truck's radio, which had been silent, crackled, and a distorted but clearly masculine voice filled the cab. "Truck driver, stop the vehicle immediately. I repeat, stop the vehicle. You are under investigation for illegal cargo transport." The general chuckled softly. Illegal cargo transport, he thought. The irony was palpable. They were using the very language of corruption against him. He didn't respond. The voice repeated, louder, more threatening. "Last warning, if you don't stop, we will be forced to use force." He saw the sedan approach again, this time with more audacity. The front passenger lowered the window. A man in a dark hoodie, holding what appeared to be an extendable baton, waved at him, gesturing for him to stop. The general kept his gaze fixed on the road, ignoring the threat. He knew confrontation was imminent. The cargo, the honor, the principle, everything was at stake. He couldn't stop. Not now. Not like this. He needed a plan, and fast. The mountain pass continued, and with each curve the tension mounted. He was General Marco Antonio de Oliveira, and he would not be silenced. Not by these vermin. He pressed a discreet button on the dashboard, activating a smokescreen system at the rear of the truck, a safety measure for extreme situations. It wasn't to escape, but to buy time, to create a smoke curtain that could disorient his pursuers. The war had begun, and he was ready to fight. The honor of the army depended on it, and he, the truck driver general, would not fail. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira didn't hesitate. His finger pressed the discreet button on the dashboard, and the engine's roar mingled with the hiss of the smokescreen system. In an instant, a dense, almost impenetrable cloud erupted from the rear of the truck, engulfing the road and the vehicles pursuing him. The rearview mirror became a grey blur, and the headlights that had once blinded him were now just diffuse halos in the toxic mist. Muffled shouts and desperate honks echoed in the night, followed by the screech of tires on the asphalt. The general felt the impact of sudden braking, a tremor that ran through the truck's structure. They had been caught by surprise. It was the opportunity he needed. Without a second thought, he accelerated, the diesel engine roaring in protest, but responding with a brute force that propelled the truck forward. The smoke wouldn't last forever, and he knew those men weren't ones to give up easily. Pure adrenaline coursed through his veins, but his mind remained clear, analytical. It wasn't the first time he had faced the enemy in the dark, where visibility was a luxury and every shadow could hide a threat. The truck, his steel fortress, was now an extension of his own body, a heavy and imposing weapon. Over the radio, the distorted voice returned, now with palpable anger. "You'll regret this, truck driver. Stop now, or the consequences will be severe." The general ignored it. Consequences? He was already living the consequences of a lifetime dedicated to honor, now stained by the corruption trying to silence him. The smoke began to dissipate slowly, carried by the wind of speed. On the tracker, the red dots reorganized, closer now. They had closed the distance, and the pursuers' irritation was evident in their more aggressive movements. The dark sedan appeared first, attempting a daring maneuver to flank the truck from the left, even with the narrow and winding road. The general, anticipating the move, swerved the truck slightly to the left, forcing the sedan to back off to avoid being crushed against the embankment. The pickup truck, in turn, tried a different approach. Instead of overtaking, it dangerously approached from the right, almost scraping the side of the truck. In the mirror, the general saw the pickup's passenger, a corpulent man, extend his hand out the window. In his hand, there was no baton but a weapon. A dry crack cut through the air, followed by the sound of something hitting the side of the truck. It wasn't a bullet, but it seemed to be a rubber bullet or some kind of non-lethal projectile, designed to scare or damage the vehicle without causing an immediate fatal accident. The general felt the impact, but the improvised armor he had discreetly installed in the cab, a detail of his mission preparation, absorbed most of the shock. They were escalating the aggression. It was no longer just intimidation, it was a direct attack. They want the cargo, the general thought, or perhaps just to stop me and discredit me. But what they don't know is that the real cargo is me, and the truth I carry. The road continued to climb, the curves becoming tighter, and the general knew he was on unfavorable terrain. A heavy truck was slow on ascents and difficult to maneuver on tight turns. He needed an advantage, something that could turn the tide. His eyes swept the dark landscape, searching for any detail, any imperfection in the road that could be used. Suddenly, an idea sparked in his mind, a risky maneuver, but one that might work. He remembered a section of the road he had studied on the map before leaving, a poorly marked detour to an old disused quarry. It was a dangerous route, full of potholes and unlit, but it could be the key to shaking off his pursuers. He slowed down, pretending to lose control on a sharp bend. The sedan and pickup truck, seeing the opportunity, accelerated to corner him. The general waited for the exact moment, calculating the distance and speed. At the apex of the curve, with both vehicles almost glued to his sides, he sharply turned the steering wheel to the right, almost at a 90-degree angle, and floored the accelerator. The truck screeched, its rear wheels skidding for an instant before finding traction. He had turned into the quarry detour, a dark and uneven track that seemed to swallow the truck. The pursuers, caught by surprise by the unexpected maneuver, had no time to react. The sedan drove straight past the entrance, losing sight of the general for a moment. The pickup truck, more agile, managed to brake and turn, but not without losing precious time. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira felt a mixture of relief and tension. He had gained a few seconds, perhaps a minute, but now he was on even more dangerous terrain. The dirt road was riddled with potholes, full of loose stones, and visibility was almost nil. The truck rattled violently, the cargo swaying in the back. He turned on the fog lights, their beams cutting through the darkness and revealing a treacherous path ahead. On the tracker, the red dots reappeared. They were on his tail again, determined not to let him escape. The quarry, which he hoped would be a temporary refuge, could become his tomb. But the general would not yield. He was a general, and a general does not retreat. The honor of the army depended on it, and he, the truck driver general, would not fail. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just starting to get interesting. The dust from the disused quarry rose like a ghost, engulfing the truck in an opaque cloud that the fog lights could barely penetrate. Every jolt was a blow, every stone a challenge. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira gripped the steering wheel with the strength of a man holding the destiny of a country in his hands. The engine's roar mingled with the crackle of stones whipping the undercarriage, the groaning of the suspension, and the violent swaying of the cargo in the back. He felt every movement, every vibration, as if the truck were an extension of his own body. In the rearview mirror, the red dots on the tracker approached, stubborn, relentless. The pickup truck and sedan had managed to realign, and now, with the smoke dissipated, the chase resumed with renewed ferocity. The voice on the radio, previously full of anger, now seemed to have a mocking tone. "Did you think you'd shake us off so easily, truck driver? This quarry is a dead end for you." The general smiled bitterly. They didn't know that for a general, a dead end was just a new battlefield. The dirt road narrowed, flanked by piles of gravel and rocks, some as large as small cars. To the right, the darkness revealed the mouth of an abyss, a steep precipice that disappeared into the night. One mistake, one slip, and all would be lost. But fear had no place in the general's heart. Only strategy. The sedan, more agile, tried a new tactic. It sped ahead on a short straight, attempting to position itself in front of the truck with the clear intention of blocking the path. The general, anticipating the maneuver, did not yield. Instead of braking, he maintained speed, swerving the truck to the right, almost scraping a pile of crushed stone. The sedan was forced to sharply retreat to avoid being crushed, raising an even larger cloud of dust. Meanwhile, the pickup truck approached from the left, and the general saw the passenger, the corpulent man, again extend his hand out the window. This time, the sound was different. A drier, more metallic crack. A projectile, likely rubber, hit the side of the truck with force, leaving a mark on the armor. They were testing the vehicle's resistance, looking for a weak point. "They want to immobilize me," the general thought. "Not kill me yet. They want the cargo, or me, intact enough to discredit me." He knew that corruption preferred humiliation to elimination, especially when it concerned someone who could expose their crimes. The road began to descend on a steep ramp, full of ruts and potholes. The truck, with its weight, gained speed dangerously. The general shifted into a lower gear, using the engine brake to control the descent, but the inertia was treacherous. He saw ahead a sharp left turn, and soon after, what appeared to be an abandoned loading area, with a rusty crane and some ruined metal structures. It was an opportunity. He waited. The pickup truck and sedan, seeing the truck on an uncontrolled descent, accelerated to approach, believing he was losing control. At the exact moment, the truck reached the lowest point of the ramp, and the two vehicles were almost glued to its rear. The general made his move. With a quick and decisive movement, he turned the steering wheel to the right, not for the left curve, but towards a side ramp, almost hidden by the darkness and a pile of debris. The truck screeched, its rear wheels kicking up a curtain of dust and stones. He had entered an even more inhospitable area of the quarry, a labyrinth of ore piles and abandoned machinery. The pursuers, caught by surprise a second time, had no time to react. The sedan, trying to keep up, skidded dangerously on the main curve, almost hitting the rock face. The pickup truck managed to turn, but lost valuable ground, swallowed by the dust raised by the truck. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira didn't look back. His eyes swept the terrain ahead. The smell of rusty metal and damp dust filled the cab. He was in a minefield of obstacles. Carcasses of old trucks, mountains of gravel, and the skeleton of a giant rock crusher. It was a place where a heavy truck could easily get stuck, but also a place where the agility of smaller vehicles could be nullified. He saw a narrow passage between two piles of ore, barely wide enough for the truck. It was a risk. If he missed, he would get stuck, but it was a risk worth taking. He accelerated, the engine roaring in a final effort, and the truck squeezed through the passage, its sides scraping against the dirt and stone walls. Behind him, the pursuers' shouts of frustration echoed. The sedan, too wide for the passage, was forced to stop. The narrower pickup truck tried to follow, but the general, with one last trick, activated the smokescreen system again, right at the passage entrance. A dense, suffocating cloud erupted, blocking the pickup truck's vision and path. He had gained a few more moments, but he knew it wasn't the end. The quarry was a labyrinth, and he needed to find the exit before his pursuers cornered him. The honor of the army depended on it, and he, the truck driver general, would not yield. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just starting to get interesting. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira smelled the acrid exhaust smoke, mixed with the dust and rusty metal that seemed to permeate the quarry air. He had bought time, but he knew it was a fragile truce, a breath before the next storm. The dense cloud he left behind at the entrance to the narrow passage was a temporary barrier, but not a definitive impediment. His pursuers were persistent, and the anger in their voices over the radio indicated that humiliation only made them more dangerous. The truck, a giant of metal and fiber, rattled violently as he advanced through a labyrinth of ore piles, abandoned machine carcasses, and twisted metal structures that resembled the skeletons of prehistoric monsters. Visibility was a constant challenge. The fog lights cut through the darkness, revealing treacherous craters and loose rocks that threatened to tear the tires at any moment. Every jolt was a test for the suspension, every curve a challenge for the heavy vehicle's inertia. He remembered the quarry maps he had studied, a meticulous detail of his preparation. He knew there was a secondary exit, an old service road used for heavy material transport, which led back to the main highway a few kilometers ahead. The problem was getting there. The path was likely blocked or in terrible condition, and the quarry was a nest of traps for a truck. In the rearview mirror, through the still dissipating dust and residual smoke, he saw the lights of the enemy vehicles reappear. They had found a way to bypass or cross the blockade. The more agile pickup truck seemed to have pulled ahead, while the sedan, with its greater mass, struggled to keep up. The voice on the radio, now with a cold, threatening tone, echoed in the cab. "You won't escape, General. This quarry is your end." Marco Antonio smiled, a bitter and determined smile. "They don't understand," he thought. "For a soldier, the end of one path is just the beginning of another." He accelerated, the engine roaring in response, forcing the truck up a steep ramp of loose gravel. The rear wheels spun for an instant, kicking up a cloud of dust that engulfed him. He smelled burning rubber, but the truck found traction and continued to climb. At the top of the ramp, he saw an even more desolate scene, an open-pit ore valley with vertical rock walls and a bottom dotted with dark water puddles and mud. There was a narrow path, almost a goat trail, that snaked along the edge of the valley. It was risky. One mistake and the truck would tumble into the abyss. But it was the only path that seemed to lead towards the secondary exit. He shifted into a lower gear, controlling the truck with surgical precision. The wheels scraped dangerously at the edge of the precipice, and he could feel the vehicle's weight pulling him down. With each meter, the tension mounted. He was a general, but also an experienced truck driver, and the fusion of these two skills was what kept him alive. The impatient pickup truck attempted a daring maneuver. It approached from the left, trying to force the truck towards the edge of the precipice. The passenger, the corpulent man, extended his hand again, this time with a weapon that appeared to fire an incendiary projectile. A streak of light cut through the darkness, hitting the side of the truck with a crack and a flash. The improvised armor resisted, but the impact was strong enough to make the truck swerve dangerously. Marco Antonio reacted instinctively. Instead of swerving away, he sharply turned the steering wheel to the left, towards the pickup truck. The maneuver caught the pursuers by surprise. The pickup truck was forced to brake and swerve to avoid being crushed against the rock face, losing balance for an instant. The general seized the opportunity. He floored the accelerator, the engine roaring in a desperate effort, and the truck lunged forward, gaining a few precious meters. He was approaching an area where the map indicated an old wooden bridge, used to cross a deep chasm in the terrain. If the bridge was still standing, it would be his chance. If not, it would be a dead end. The dust raised by the truck was so dense that he could barely see 10 meters ahead. He relied on his memory and instincts. Suddenly the headlights cut through the dust, revealing the silhouette of the bridge. It looked precarious, groaning under the weight of years and abandonment, but it was there. There was a rusty, almost illegible sign, warning of danger and weight limits. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira knew his truck far exceeded that limit. It was a calculated risk. He didn't hesitate. With his pursuers rapidly approaching, he had no other option. He shifted into a higher gear, accelerating towards the bridge. The truck hit the structure with a dull thud, and the old wood groaned in protest. The planks creaked, snapped, and he felt the bridge sway violently under the colossal weight. With every meter, it seemed the structure would give way. In the rearview mirror, he saw the pickup truck and sedan stop at the bridge's entrance, hesitant. They knew the bridge wouldn't support the weight of 3 vehicles, much less the truck and one of them. The general had put himself in an all-or-nothing gamble. He was in the middle of the bridge, and it was giving way. Cracks appeared in the planks, and the sound of wood splitting echoed in the night. The truth is heavy, the general thought, and sometimes, to carry it, you have to burn some bridges. He felt the ground give way under the rear wheels. A deafening crash cut through the air, and the back part of the bridge collapsed into an abyss of darkness and stones. The truck lurched violently, but the front wheels were already on solid ground. He had made it by a hair's breadth. Behind him, the pursuers' lights were stopped on the other side of the chasm, now impassable. Shouts of rage and frustration echoed in the night. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira took a deep breath, his heart pounding, but his mind clear. He had cut off the path, but the road was still long. The quarry had been a battlefield, and he had emerged victorious for now. But the war was far from over. The honor of the army depended on it. And he, the truck driver general, would not fail. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just starting to get interesting. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira felt the final thud of the truck on the firm ground on the other side of the chasm. The air was thick with the smell of dust and broken wood. Behind him, the echo of the bridge's collapse still resonated, a cry of metal and wood against the night. The lights of the enemy vehicles, now diminished by distance, and the impassable barrier seemed like points of rage and frustration. He had cut off the path, literally. That abyss now separated them, but not for long, he knew. The quarry was a labyrinth, but not a dead end for those with resources and determination. The general's heart still pounded, a war drum in his chest, but his mind was cold and calculating. He had gained a reprieve, not the final victory. The road ahead was unknown, but the direction was clear, the secondary exit, the old service road that promised to lead him back to civilization and to the delivery of truth. The truck, a wounded but still potent lion, groaned under the effort. The suspension creaked, the sides scratched by the narrow passage, but the engine still roared with surprising vitality. He shifted into a higher gear, accelerating over a stretch of flatter, yet still uneven terrain. The mental map of the quarry unfolded in his mind, every curve, every elevation, every possible trap. The secondary exit was a gamble. He knew that if the quarry was a nest of illegal operations, that exit would likely be blocked or guarded. His pursuers were not amateurs. They would have contingencies. Over the radio, the colonel's voice, now laden with pure hatred, burst into the cab. "Oliveira, you won't get out of there! We've already activated the blockade at the exit. You're surrounded, General. Surrender now, and perhaps we can negotiate your dignity." Marco Antonio chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Dignity isn't negotiated. Colonel, it's earned. And yours went down the drain a long time ago." He turned off the radio, cutting off the colonel's enraged voice. There was no more time for provocations. The battle was real, and the next few minutes would be decisive. He saw the lights of the secondary exit, a sliver of hope in the darkness. It was a steep ramp, flanked by piles of debris and machine carcasses. At the top, the silhouette of an old iron gate, rusty and seemingly abandoned, but he knew appearances could be deceiving. As he approached, the truck's headlights revealed the truth. The gate was not abandoned. Two vehicles, a black pickup truck and a camouflage military jeep, were parked transversely, completely blocking the passage. These were new reinforcements, positioned to intercept him. Armed men, in ballistic vests and with rifles in hand, were positioned behind the vehicles, ready to shoot. A spotlight beam swept the terrain, trapping the truck in its glare. "Stop! Hands on your head! Exit the vehicle, General!" The voice, amplified by a megaphone, was cold and authoritative, but not the colonel's. It was a new voice, more professional, more dangerous. Marco Antonio didn't hesitate. He had no way through, but he wouldn't surrender either. He had a cargo to deliver, a truth to reveal, and he would do it, no matter the cost. He slammed on the brakes, making the truck skid and stop a few meters from the blockade. The engine still roared, keeping him ready for any movement. The armed men approached, rifles pointed at the cab. He could see the tension on their faces, their readiness for combat. But he also saw uncertainty. They were dealing with an army general, even if disguised. There was a protocol, a line they couldn't easily cross. He opened the cab door slowly, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender, but his eyes swept the terrain, looking for an opening, a weakness in the blockade. There was a small gap between the jeep and the rock face, barely wide enough for a man, but certainly not for the truck. "Exit the vehicle, General!" the megaphone voice repeated, now with a tone of impatience. Marco Antonio descended, keeping his hands visible. His eyes met those of the man with the megaphone, a lieutenant colonel with a stern expression, but who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. "Lieutenant Colonel, do you know who you're dealing with? Do you know the consequences of your actions?" The lieutenant colonel hesitated for an instant. "We are following orders, General. Arrest orders for insubordination and desertion. Insubordination to corruption, yes. Desertion of truth, never." Marco Antonio replied, his voice firm, laden with authority. He knew he was playing on the soldiers' loyalty. As the exchange of words occurred, he noticed a crucial detail. The military jeep, though blocking the passage, had one of its rear tires slightly underinflated, almost touching the rock face. A minuscule flaw, but one that could be exploited. Suddenly, the lieutenant colonel's radio crackled. It was the colonel's voice, furious. "Don't waste time with him, Lieutenant Colonel. Shoot if he doesn't cooperate. He's a traitor." The lieutenant colonel frowned, visibly divided. The order was clear, but the general's figure, even there, unarmed, commanded respect. Marco Antonio knew his time was running out. He had to act, and fast. He had one last card up his sleeve, a desperate maneuver that could cost him everything, but was the only chance to get through. He needed a distraction, an instant of chaos. His eyes fixed on the jeep. He had an idea, a crazy, dangerous idea, but one that might work. He prepared himself, body tense, mind focused. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just starting to get interesting. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just starting to get interesting. General Marco Antonio de Oliveira felt the weight of the colonel's words echoing on the radio. An execution order disguised as an arrest. But he was no traitor, and he would not surrender. His eyes, sharp as an eagle's, swept the terrain, fixing on the crucial detail. That rear tire of the military jeep, slightly flat, almost kissing the rock face. A minuscule flaw, an invitation to chaos. Lieutenant Colonel, Marco Antonio's voice cut through the air, laden with an authority that transcended the truck driver's uniform. You were trained to defend the nation, not to be a henchman for corrupt officials. Your orders come from a man who dishonors the army. Think carefully about the consequences, not for me, but for your career, for your honor, for the honor of your men. The lieutenant colonel, visibly disturbed, hesitated. His eyes moved between the imposing figure of the general and the armed soldiers who watched the scene with a mixture of tension and curiosity. Their loyalty was being tested, and Marco Antonio knew it. It was a risky gamble, but it was the only one he had. Suddenly, the lieutenant colonel's radio crackled again, the colonel's voice, now in a crescendo of fury, exploding into the night. I said, shoot, you imbecile. He's a traitor. Don't hesitate. Fire. The order was clear, brutal, and the lieutenant colonel pressed his lips together, his hand trembling slightly. His eyes, for an instant, met Marco Antonio's. There was a spark of recognition, perhaps of respect, perhaps of fear, before the mask of sternness returned. He raised his hand, his mouth opening to give the fatal order, but Marco Antonio was faster. He didn't wait. At the exact moment the lieutenant colonel's hand began to descend, the general acted. Instead of running forward, towards the gap he had noticed, he spun on his heels with surprising agility for a man of his age and build, and launched into a desperate sprint back to the truck's cab. Stop him! Don't let him! The lieutenant colonel's voice erupted, but it was too late. The surprise of the maneuver, the soldier's hesitation to shoot an unarmed general who was technically surrendering a second before, gave him the precious seconds he needed. He leaped into the cab, the truck's armored body serving as a shield. The door slammed shut with a dull thud, and before anyone could react, Marco Antonio was already in the driver's seat, his hands firm on the steering wheel. He didn't waste a second. The gear lever was thrown back forcefully, the truck's engine roaring in a guttural, menacing sound. The soldiers, now in a panic, began to raise their rifles. Some shots echoed in the night, bullets ricocheting off the truck's improvised armor with a sharp metallic sound. But Marco Antonio wasn't looking forward. His eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, calculating the distance, the angle. With a final roar of the engine, he floored the accelerator. The truck, a mass of metal and fury, shot backward. The target was the military jeep, the flat tire, the rock face. The impact was deafening. The truck hit the jeep with the force of a battering ram, crushing it against the rock face. The tire, already compromised, burst with a bang. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and the jeep was pushed aside, spinning on itself like a broken toy. The gap between the jeep and the rock, previously narrow, now opened into a forced but sufficient passage. Shouts of surprise and fury echoed. The soldiers who were behind the jeep were thrown aside, some falling, others shielding themselves from the impact and shrapnel. The stunned lieutenant colonel could barely shout a coherent order. Marco Antonio didn't wait to see the damage. With the Jeep now a twisted carcass and the path partially cleared, he engaged first gear, sharply turned the steering wheel and floored the accelerator again. The truck, with a new roar, lunged forward, passing through the newly created opening. The black pickup truck, the other vehicle blocking the passage, tried to react, but was caught by surprise. The driver attempted to maneuver to close the path, but it was too late. Marco Antonio's truck scraped past, tearing off part of the pickup's side with a sound of ripping metal. He was free, or almost. In the rearview mirror, he saw the chaos he had left behind: the destroyed Jeep, the damaged pickup truck, the soldiers regrouping, some firing desperate shots that vanished into the darkness. The colonel's voice, now a pure roar of hatred, burst over the radio, but Marco Antonio merely smiled. He had broken the blockade, but he knew the pursuit wouldn't end there. The secondary road opened before him, dark and winding, but promising freedom. The truck, now with more scratches and dents but still powerful, roared in response to his command. The truth he carried was closer to being revealed. The battle was far from over, but he had won another round. And with each round, the stakes grew higher. He had to reach his destination. The honor of the army depended on it, and he, the truck driver general, would not fail. The dust raised by the Jeep's impact against the rock still hung in the air, a ghostly veil over the chaos Marco Antonio had left behind. The truck engine's roar was a hymn of defiance, a cry of freedom echoing along the secondary road. He had broken the blockade, but the feeling of victory was ephemeral. Adrenaline pulsed through his veins, keeping him alert, every nerve tense, every sense sharpened. The darkness of the night was both his ally and his enemy, hiding both the path ahead and the approaching dangers. In the rearview mirror, the lights of the enemy vehicles began to reorganize. The black pickup truck, with its dented side, and the camouflage military Jeep, now with a blown tire and a twisted front, were just the first. Other, more distant lights appeared on the horizon, like predators scenting blood. The colonel would not give up. Not now. The humiliation of being outsmarted by a truck driver and the destruction of his blockade would only fuel his fury. Marco Antonio could almost hear the colonel's roars of hatred over the radio, even without tuning it in. The secondary road was a tangle of tight curves and steep ascents, a forgotten path that snaked through an area of dense forest and some stretches of rugged terrain. It wasn't a road for heavy trucks, but Marco Antonio knew every inch of that region. He had participated in training exercises there years ago, memorizing every shortcut, every blind spot, every natural trap. This was his advantage. He threw the truck into a tight curve, feeling the cargo's weight sway dangerously. The tires screeched on the uneven asphalt, but he maintained control with the skill of an experienced driver. It wasn't just brute force, it was technique, precision, and a deep understanding of vehicle physics. He needed to buy time, create distance, force his pursuers to make mistakes. Suddenly, the truck's radio, which he had turned on to monitor enemy communications, crackled. The colonel's voice, distorted by rage and static, exploded into the cab. "He's on the secondary road. Don't let him escape. Block all exits. I want that traitor dead or alive. Preferably dead." The order was a war cry, a testament to desperation. Marco Antonio gripped the steering wheel, a bitter smile on his lips. Traitor, he thought. He was the only one there defending the honor of the army. The pursuers' lights seemed to multiply. Two vehicles, faster and more agile, began to close the distance. They were patrol vehicles, likely, equipped for chases. Marco Antonio knew he couldn't simply outrun them. The truck was powerful, but it wasn't a race car. He needed a strategy. His eyes swept the dashboard, then the mental map he had of the region. There was a detour ahead, an old service trail used by logging companies, which cut through the forest and emerged onto a state highway several kilometers away. It was a brutal path. almost impassable for ordinary vehicles, but perhaps, just perhaps, for his armored truck. It was a high-risk gamble, but time was running out. He saw the pursuers' lights approaching, headlights reflecting in the rearview mirrors. They were gaining ground. The colonel, in his fury, would probably order them to shoot to kill as soon as they had a clear chance. Marco Antonio couldn't allow that. The truth he carried was more important than his own life. With a sudden decision, he sharply turned the steering wheel to the right, towards the trail entrance. There was no signage, just an almost imperceptible opening in the dense forest. The maneuver was so abrupt that the vehicles behind him were caught by surprise, driving straight past the entrance. One of them, a jeep, tried to brake and make the turn, but skidded dangerously, almost overturning. Marco Antonio's truck plunged into the darkness of the trail. Tree branches whipped against the bodywork, scratching the armor. The suspension groaned under the weight, while the wheels fought for traction on the loose earth and stones. It was an inferno of jolts and noises, but he didn't hesitate. The trail was narrow, barely allowing the truck to pass, but this also meant his pursuers would have even greater difficulties. In the rearview mirror, he saw the lights of the enemy vehicles stop at the trail entrance. They were hesitating. That path was not for them. But Marco Antonio knew the hesitation would be brief. The colonel would not allow him to escape so easily. He would hear the colonel's fury on the radio again, orders to follow him no matter the cost. He gritted his teeth, his body tense. With every meter he advanced, the trail became more treacherous, darker. The truck was a metal monster, but even monsters had limits. He needed to stay focused, his mind clear, the objective in mind. The honor of the army, the truth, justice. Everything depended on him. Suddenly a different sound broke through the engine's roar and the crackle of branches, a distant but unmistakable sound. The whirring of rotors. The colonel had escalated the pursuit, a helicopter. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just starting to get desperate. Marco Antonio knew time was running out. The trail was a trap, but also his only chance. He had to reach his destination, and he would do it, no matter the cost. The distant whirring of rotors quickly transformed into a growing roar, a metallic predator cutting through the night's silence. Marco Antonio gripped the steering wheel, his body tense, his eyes sweeping the dark sky above the treetops. The colonel was not playing around. A helicopter meant the pursuit had escalated to a level of desperation and brutality he had hoped to avoid. The trail, once his ally, now seemed like a trap, a narrow slit in the dense forest that, from above, would be an easy target. A powerful beam of light burst through the leaves, dancing over the vegetation like a giant, inquisitive eye. The helicopter was low, scanning the forest, searching for the truck's dark mass. Marco Antonio floored the accelerator, the engine roaring in protest as the vehicle bounced over exposed roots and loose stones. Every jolt was a reminder of the fragility of his situation, of the thin line between escape and capture. Over the radio, the colonel's voice burst forth again, now with terrifying clarity, mingled with the sound of the rotors. "There it is, the truck! Don't let it out of sight! Prepare to shoot if he tries anything!" The order was clear, a testament that Marco Antonio's life was worthless to the colonel. He was a target, a threat to be eliminated. Marco Antonio threw the truck into a sharp curve, the rear wheels skidding on the mud and wet leaves. The maneuver was abrupt, almost causing the vehicle to overturn. But he controlled it with mastery. The helicopter's light lost him for an instant, struggling to keep up with the surprising speed and agility of the truck on such hostile terrain. He needed more than that. He needed cover. His eyes swept the trail ahead. There was a section where the forest closed in even more, the trees intertwining into an almost impenetrable canopy. It was a risk, as the trail became even narrower and more treacherous, but it was his only chance to hide from aerial view. He accelerated, the truck gaining speed, the suspension groaning under the constant impact. The helicopter, sensing the evasive maneuver, descended even lower, the rotor wash whipping the trees and kicking up a cloud of dust and leaves. The light swept the area again, more desperate, more aggressive. Shots. The dry sound of gunfire echoed in the night, bullets ricocheting off the truck's armor with a sharp metallic clang. These weren't warning shots, they were shots to kill. Marco Antonio felt the impact, but the armor held. He was a general, not an ordinary truck driver, and that was no ordinary truck. He had anticipated that the situation could escalate, and the vehicle had been modified to withstand small arms attacks. But an attack helicopter was another story. He couldn't take many more hits like that. He plunged into the densest section of the forest. Thick branches whipped against the bodywork with fury, some snapping with loud cracks. The tree canopy closed above him, transforming the trail into a dark, claustrophobic tunnel. The helicopter's light struggled to penetrate, creating ghostly patterns of light and shadow that danced before him. For a brief moment he was invisible, but the advantage was temporary. The helicopter wouldn't give up. He could hear the sound of the rotors hovering above, the crew trying to find an opening, a weak point, and the ground forces. They weren't far. The colonel wouldn't let him escape. Over the radio, the colonel's voice, now a furious snarl, echoed again. "He's under cover. Don't lose him. Ground teams, advance. Surround the area. He can't have gone far." Marco Antonio knew the net was closing. The trail was a labyrinth, but also a dead end if he didn't find an exit quickly. He needed a plan, something more than just running. The truth he carried was too heavy to be lost there, in that dark and hostile forest. Suddenly the truck hit something. A violent jolt shook the cab, and a sound of twisting metal echoed. The dashboard light flickered, and the engine sputtered for an instant. He had hit a fallen tree or perhaps a rock that the darkness had hidden. The truck stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the helicopter and the sound of approaching footsteps on the trail. He was trapped. The truth, the honor of the army, everything was at stake. Marco Antonio looked at the dashboard, at the damage indicators. The truck was wounded but not dead. He had to get out of there. But how? Time was running out, and the footsteps were getting closer. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just starting to get desperate. The silence that followed the impact was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the helicopter and the sound of approaching footsteps on the trail. Marco Antonio was trapped, the truck wounded, but his mind, sharp as a blade, was already working on a new plan. He was not a man to give up. The honor of the army, the truth he carried, were far more important than his own life. His eyes swept the dashboard quickly. The engine had sputtered, but not died completely. The electrical system was unstable, but there was still power. He couldn't move the truck easily, not without risking irreparable damage or worse, becoming an easy target. The footsteps were closer now, accompanied by muffled voices. They knew he was there. With a swift movement, Marco Antonio turned off the truck's headlights, plunging the cab and the surrounding area into near-total darkness, broken only by the intermittent dashboard light and the beams of the pursuers' flashlights beginning to penetrate the foliage. He drew his service pistol, a standard army weapon, but in his hands, an extension of his will. Then he reached for a small encrypted tactical radio, which he had kept hidden. This was not the truck's radio, but a direct channel to high command, activated only in extreme emergencies. He didn't have time for a long message. Target engaged. Current position, logging trail, Sector Delta 7. Request immediate support and air cover. Colonel Almeida compromised. Repeat, Colonel Almeida compromised. His voice was calm, controlled, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He knew every second counted. The message was a code, a signal that the secret inspection had reached its critical point. With the message sent, he opened the driver's door, not to exit, but to create a distraction. He activated the truck's sound system, turning the radio to a loud, distorted music station, and switched on the headlights again, pointing them forward, blinding anyone coming from that direction. The pursuers, seeing the light and hearing the sound, would focus their attention on the truck. Marco Antonio, however, was no longer there. He had slipped out the passenger side, using the darkness and dense forest as cover. He moved like a shadow, his years of army training coming to the fore. Every step was calculated, every movement silent. He wasn't fleeing, he was maneuvering. The helicopter, still hovering, now focused its light on the stopped truck, its gunners likely preparing for a final assault. But Marco Antonio was already far from there, crawling through the dense vegetation, circling the truck and heading towards the point from where he heard the colonel's voice on the radio, the improvised command center of that corrupt operation. He heard the first shots against the truck, bullets ricocheting off the armor. "Shoot! Shoot to kill! He can't escape!" Colonel Almeida's voice echoed over the radio, a mix of fury and desperation. Marco Antonio smiled bitterly. The colonel was falling into the trap. In a few minutes, he found the first group of the colonel's soldiers. There were 3 men, armed but inattentive, focused on the truck. Marco Antonio neutralized them quickly, using hand-to-hand combat techniques he had perfected over decades. Silently, efficiently. He didn't want unnecessary deaths, just incapacitation. He was a general, not a killer. He continued to advance, with each meter approaching his objective. The colonel's voice was clearer now, without the distortion of the truck's radio. He was close. Marco Antonio spotted a partial clearing where Colonel Almeida stood, surrounded by a few more men, all looking at the truck, which was now being incessantly fired upon. The colonel held a radio in his hand, gesticulating furiously. "He's there! Finish him! Leave nothing behind!" The colonel shouted, his voice hoarse with rage. Marco Antonio emerged from the shadows, his pistol pointed not at the colonel, but at the ground in front of him. "Colonel Almeida!" His voice, calm and authoritative, cut through the air like a whip. The colonel turned abruptly, his eyes wide with surprise and, for a brief instant, fear. His men turned too, raising their weapons, but Marco Antonio was already in position, his weapon pointed at the ground, yet with unquestionable authority. "General Marco Antonio de Oliveira, on secret inspection," he declared, and with his free hand, he drew his army general's official ID, holding it up for all to see. The moonlight, now beginning to pierce the clouds, reflected off the golden emblem. Colonel Almeida paled, the radio falling from his hands and hitting the ground with a dull thud. His eyes, previously full of fury, were now filled with icy terror. His men, confused, slowly lowered their weapons, realizing the gravity of the situation. That was no ordinary truck driver, that was a general. You're the general?" The colonel stammered, his voice an incredulous whisper. "Yes, Colonel. And you are under arrest for extortion, abuse of power, and attempted murder of a superior officer in the line of duty," Marco Antonio replied, his voice firm, without a hint of emotion. At that exact moment, the helicopter's hum changed. It was no longer the sound of a predator, but of an aircraft moving away, and another sound, more powerful, more organized, began to approach. Strong lights burst onto the trail, not the erratic lights of the pursuers, but the powerful headlights of standard military vehicles. They were army jeeps and trucks, with special operations and military police teams. Marco Antonio's encrypted message had reached its destination. The support units were there. The colonel's soldiers, seeing the arrival of legitimate forces, dropped their weapons to the ground. There was nowhere left to run. Colonel Almeida, his face contorted into a mask of despair and defeat, tried to say something, but the words died in his throat. "Colonel Almeida, you are in custody," said a military police officer, approaching with his team. and all your men involved in this illegal operation." Marco Antonio watched as the colonel was handcuffed, his once imposing figure now bowed in shame. The truth had prevailed. The honor of the army, which he so valued, had been defended. He looked up at the sky, where stars began to appear amidst the scattered clouds. The secret inspection had been a success, but at a high cost. That truck driver, who was in fact a general, had risked everything to expose corruption. And, in doing so, he reaffirmed that even in the shadows, justice and the integrity of the army would always find their way. The battle was far from over for the colonel, but for General Marco Antonio, the mission was accomplished. He had proven that, in the army, no rank can buy honor.